Hello and welcome to our third monthly webinar hosted by the Imaginarium Communities of Practice. And today we'll be focused on the topic of learner as lead and teacher as facilitator. My name is Megan Hennessy. I'm an innovation partner with the Imaginarium, which is the innovation lab of Denver Public Schools. I'll be moderating this afternoon and turning it over to Elisa Bowers, my colleague, to lead the discussion momentarily. We, the Imaginarium, are focused on stimulating and supporting innovation across Denver, in addition to the Denver Public Schools. And our mission is to transform learning in public education systems. Communities of Practice is a branch of the Imaginarium that focuses on professional development for ourselves and colleagues around the district and the nation. Our goals within the Communities of Practice is to support educators and generating new knowledge and primarily using some of our technology opportunities and our collaborative opportunities to allow educators to learn from each other. This webinar is an example of one of those opportunities in generating new knowledge and collaborating with each other. We want to engage colleagues across schools. Again, this webinar is that opportunity to engage not only colleagues across the district schools, but across the country. And last but not least, identify and share those effective practices, which is why we have we're hosting a teacher panel today to hear directly from those teachers as to what's happening in the classroom along the lines of learner as lead and teacher as facilitator. Some logistics for the webinar this afternoon. We would love all of you to right now use the chat feature on the right-hand side of your screen to introduce yourselves and enter your role. And I'll give everyone a moment to do that. And if anyone is confused as to why you're not seeing yourself or hearing anyone else, only the presenters have access to both the camera and the microphone this afternoon. In addition to engaging in the webinar in person or electronically, we also will be recording this webinar and uploading it to the Imaginarium website, listed there on the screen, imaginarium.dpsk12.org. And you can always find these webinars on the resource page. Our agenda for the next hour is to first introduce not only Elisa Bowers, but our guest teacher panel, and do some foundational setting on what we mean by learner as lead and teacher as facilitator in the classroom. Then we're going to move into some direct instruction in not only defining some of those terms, but talking a little bit about specific strategies. Then we're going to toss it over to our teacher panel and hear directly from our teachers as to how they're moving the needle from controlling that classroom and teachers being the leader in the classroom to learners being the leader in the classroom. And then we'll finish by doing some Q&A and opening it up to all of you. So feel free to enter questions into the chat feature as we move through the webinar. And last but not least for me, I'm going to introduce Elisa Bowers, my amazing colleague. She's also an innovation partner with the Imaginarium at DPS. And her work has not only been supporting schools and directly supporting teachers who are experimenting with learner as lead, but she also hosts and leads the peer learning group on learner as lead and teacher as facilitator for the Imaginarium. In addition to her leading that group, part of the reason that we tapped into her expertise to lead that group is because she has direct experience in the Montessori classroom, which, as many of you probably know, is directly relevant to learner as lead. So she'll be bringing that expertise to us as well. So at this point, I'm going to toss it over to Elisa Bowers. Thank you, Elisa. We're so grateful to you for leading this conversation.
The purpose of this webinar is going to hopefully help you address these two questions. What is the learner as lead, teacher as facilitator in the classroom? And how do teachers engage in the journey of giving their learners more ownership and self-direction? Through answering those two questions, we will hit these learning objectives that look at really defining what does the role look like for the learner taking the lead, and then what is the role as the teacher as the facilitator, because obviously that's going to look very different from typical traditional schools now. We'll also understand what it means for a learner to take the lead and demonstrate true agency in their learning. We'll discuss the role of the teacher and changes necessary to become that guide. The other objective that we will hit on is developing strategies for implementation. So after we figure out what is this learner taking the lead, how do I do that in my classroom? So participants will learn how to develop a culture and environment to support the learners in their classrooms to make informed decisions in their learning, to increase engagement, academic progress, and build agency in every child. So what does the learner leading their learning actually mean? It definitely includes learners being able to exercise increased control and responsibility for their learning, and for those teachers that are in their classrooms to serve as guides by providing support structures and processes to better help the kids be able to make those informed decisions. Learners are afforded the opportunities to build their identities as lifelong learners that leads to a strong sense of agency, then suggests improved academic outcomes. Learners will be seen making informed demonstrations in learning through choice, voice, and self-direction. Teachers facilitate the fostering of a couple of key attributes: intrinsic motivation, self-awareness, self-efficacy, and the sense of belonging and engagement. There are also some skills that teachers need to facilitate throughout this process. Those skills include metacognition, collaboration, technological literacy, informational literacy, and creativity and critical thinking. So why would we give control of learning over to the learners in the classroom? If we think about the current state of education and the current state of many classrooms, there is definitely a lack of learner engagement, minimal academic growth. The teacher continues to be the sage on the stage. There are some teachers that have an approach where one size fits all, especially when it comes to instruction. And teacher role is general and common for all of the learners that they serve. When I started thinking about why giving more control over to the learners in their classroom, I thought about my journey through personalized learning and my journey to becoming a Montessori teacher. And a story that keeps coming back to my mind is a story that involves my second year of being in a public Montessori classroom and going through kind of the motions, getting my feet wet, as it were, and making sure that I was really changing my practice and making sure that I was really there to facilitate and guide the learning of the children that were in my classroom. During that time, there was an opportunity that I had to work with some kids, and in a lesson that I was giving, one of the kids stayed after the lesson and asked if she could get a more difficult lesson in that same topic. And of course, me going back and thinking, I don't think she's really ready for this. And I looked back at the data, thinking about the data that had been analyzed around this student. And I had convinced myself that she wasn't ready to move on. As the days progressed, a key facet of Montessori is to make observations. And as I was observing this student, I noticed that she really, really wanted that lesson on the more difficult work, and she was taking time to watch other kids interact with the materials. And due to this, I decided that maybe she was ready for that next lesson. Within another couple of days, the student approached me again and said, "Can you please give me this lesson?" So at that time, I did finally give her lesson. My lesson learned in this whole process is that through giving the student that lesson, she actually increased her reading level by 2.25 years within that 1 year. And at that time, at the end of the year, looking back at the amazing, phenomenal growth that she had experienced, I started to think about my role and what that looked like and how potentially I was standing in the way of her growth because of what I thought was best for her. And that by equipping her with the strategies that she needed to learn, when it became more self-directed, her growing academically, and especially when it came to reading, was absolutely amazing. So what exactly is the role of the learner in this entire process? If we think about a learner typically sitting at a desk or a table, and they are just the recipients of the information, the role of the learner definitely looks differently when the learner takes the lead and becomes more self-directed. Learners then really need to know themselves. They need to know their needs and their preferences to help drive their learning. They really need to know what are the best ways that I learn? What types of kids do I need to be able to work with to better learn? Learners also need to know how to set goals, and that process is definitely scaffolded from a teacher's perspective as co-designing and going through the process of what goals are and what goal completion is, to eventually the learners being able to set their goals on their own. Learners also need to know how to follow a learner path. And that's actually the visual that you see on that slide. It involves a learning plan. And within that learner path, the learner sets a goal. There's also a portion where they can remind themselves of what they're interested in doing. Preferences and needs could also turn up there. The great thing about the learning plan that's displayed here is that it actually gives a couple of action steps so that the learner knows exactly what they need to do to be able to meet their goals to further their learning. Learners also really need to leverage metacognitive skills and collaboration to drive their learning. I see that somebody is asking about the learner plan in a bigger display, and I will see what I can do. So then, if the role of the learner is changing in this type of a classroom, then definitely the role of the teacher needs to change as well. The teacher is really key in making the learner as lead being successful. The teacher needs to create an environment to support agency. They really, really need to cultivate that culture of belonging, and it is so extremely important to build relationships with your kids. I know a lot of teachers definitely build relationships with their kids. What is a little bit different in this situation is that you actually should be planning time that helps to build relationships with the kids. Of course, it can happen by happenstance, but you need to be intentional about what you're trying to do. Teachers need to develop structures and processes to support learners to drive their own learning. They definitely need to facilitate learning individually and in small groups. Sometimes a huge misconception can be that the teacher is no longer giving any sort of direct instruction, and that's definitely not true. Teachers are still giving instruction to individual kids as well as in small groups. A teacher definitely needs to leverage the expertise to guide learners on their paths. So by expertise, I'm referring to teachers really knowing their standards and teachers really knowing their curriculum and using both of those as tools to help guide the kids. Finally, another part of the role of the teacher is, where do these ideas come from? What do teachers need to do to be able to better facilitate in their classrooms to really support the learner to be the leader of their learning? There is a framework that Denver Public Schools uses, and specifically the Imaginarium as well, and it is the Denver Public Schools Personalized Learning Driver Model. The driver model is broken up into primary drivers and secondary drivers. If you look at the slide that I have to the far left, evolving learner and teacher roles would be an example of the primary driver. And there's a quick definition of what that means. If you look more towards the right, you'll see that there are two secondary drivers within that primary driver. They are learner as lead, teacher as facilitator, and learner collaboration. We definitely use the driver model as a guide and kind of a framework to help guide teachers and their instruction. And it can be used as a self-assessment to look at where do teachers fall right now and where do they want to go. And then we discuss more of the how. How are they going to be able to build more agency within their learners for their learners to take the lead? All right. Now it is time for our amazing teacher panel, and I am going to turn it back over to Megan.
And you're just going to be hearing my voice since we have one working computer, and we're going to just turn the camera to the teacher panel. Can we see all three of you? There we go. There we go. Okay. There we are. Thank you. Thank you all. You're the teacher panel. Thank you all for being here. So I'm going to introduce from, I guess, your left to right. I'm sorry. I'm trying to turn around and figure it out based on where we are in the room. So Mike Camilleri is our first teacher. He teaches at Cheltenham Elementary. He has a variety of roles, one being the Dean of Fun, but he's also a classroom teacher as well, teaching 3rd through 5th grade ELA S math. I'll let him introduce himself and give more detail as to why you've been chosen for Learner as Lead. I could add that for all of them, but I'm going to let them speak for themselves. The second is Laura Delira. She's the ELD teacher, or English Language Development teacher, here at Cheltenham Elementary. And last but not least is Terry Duran. She's what grade level are you?
Middle school this year.
Middle school, all middle school. You're a jack of all trades in middle school. At Kepner Legacy Middle, yes. Correct? So welcome. Thank you all for being here. First question to get us started is, we'd love to, in no particular order in terms of who's starting, but we'd love to hear more about how did you start turning over that control and allowing the students to lead their own learning? So what were some of your initial steps to help the teachers out there listening?
I'll go first. Should I start by reintroducing myself really quick?
Give it a little bit on your background.
Again, Mike Camilleri. I've been teaching in Denver for 13 years now. I found myself about 7 or 8 years ago teaching 4th grade. I've been in middle school. I've taught ECE in 1st grade and kindergarten, lots of different grade levels. About 7 years ago, I found myself with a classroom full of technology, a pile of computers, and no real idea how to use them. Started implementing Khan Academy. I had heard about khanacademy.org. Started doing some differentiated math lessons with my students through Khan, kind of just letting them self-explore. It kind of blew my mind as far as to how great of a differentiation tool this technology could be. That summer, went to a few different things that were offered by the district and a few different things that were offered in the state of Colorado, learned how to flip my classroom. And so since then, I have worked in a flipped classroom where I've screencasted my lessons and done individualized skills practice and assessments and projects for kids in 4th grade for like 3 or 4 years now. I did a year where I flipped pre-K literacy. I've also done it with 1st graders and kindergartners, and I'm really a sound believer in the flipped classroom at this point. Really it all just started with just playing around with technology and some of the different resources that were available for free online with my class, like I said, 7 or 8 years ago. So.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
My name is Laura Delira. I'm teaching at Cheltenham right now. I teach all of the students who are English language learners, kindergarten through 5th grade. But before that, I taught 4th grade bilingual classroom for several years, and also did math intervention. And I first became interested in trying out some of the personalized learning strategies when I was a 4th grade teacher, and I found just out of necessity to be able to reach the needs of a huge variety of levels of students, specifically in math, and then also to engage students. I kind of started learning about students setting their own goals. And when I came into this new position here at Cheltenham, I think that I came in, there's a big kind of, when you talk about ELD, I think a lot of it's like, oh, that boring curriculum. I decided I just wasn't going to spend the year doing it that way. So this year I've been working to take the language standards that are in the curriculum and create like student-led projects where they're using the target language in a different way than just kind of one size fits all.
And Terry Duran again, Kepner Legacy. So this is our last year. So normally a middle school MI class, I'm a special ed teacher. I have a center-based classroom. So my students are intellectually disabled, most of them multiply disabled. And I have only been teaching for 9 years, and that whole time at Kepner with the center-based program. I love that work. I had done a lot of work before being introduced to Imaginarium. It just was always important to me that my students know their disabilities. Many of them come to me without knowing what their disabilities are, or some of them that they even have any. So allowing them to know their disabilities, know their strength. We talk about their strengths, their preferences, their interests, and their needs. And setting goals was always part of our daily routine, and as well as getting them more involved in the setting of their academic IEP goals. But now, last year, I was fortunate enough to be part of Imaginarium, have Elisa as my coach, dug even deeper so that my students know their we call them their brain smarts. So they know their top 2 areas based on multiple intelligence surveys. So they I have given them more choice in the classroom. I am not a flipped classroom yet. I want to get there. I think there are a whole different set of challenges when you're working with intellectually disabled students, but I have seen the most, I had the most growth in my students last year. And what I learn every year, I try to get better every year, but the biggest change was the things that I implemented due to personalized learning. And those included an incredible workspace that the kids help design based on their needs. And so now they almost always have choice of where they're going to work. That in itself has been incredible. And visibly, the students are more engaged. I know that right along with that, just behavioral data that I collect all the time. I was able to look at last year the same group of kids for the same amount of time pre-implementation of the new space, the change in choice in space, and then subsequently many more changes made based on my education in personalized learning. And it was incredible. I mean, like on our little system, behavioral management system, timeouts went from like 74 in that same amount of time down to like less than 30. Mm-hmm. Calls home went from, I think, like 34 to 7. So I had some incredible data in terms of that backed up my belief in why students were so successful last year. I've also taken baby steps. I wanted to do it all immediately and felt like I wasn't seeing enough change. And But I really find there's one book that how to make learning, or how to personalize learning, how to make learning personalized. And there's many rubrics in there for all of the components that Elisa mentioned earlier for student agency. And so my goal is tailored to moving them up that, those progressions. Yeah, I kind of lost my train of thought.
Thank you all. And thank you for thanking each other as well. That was very, very polite.
Well, thank you.
We do have some questions that are coming in from a few people in the chat. So Katie was wondering about explicit examples that you might offer to manage personalized learning. And when I'm guessing she's maybe talking about when you are personalizing, you're looking at the needs of every single student and how do you manage the logistics of that, and or she could be talking about classroom management, so one or the other. So whatever advice you have to offer on either of those.
Well, I mean, it takes some versatility, right? Like personalized learning, individualized learning, learner-led learning is not an immediate Band-Aid for classroom culture issues. So if you're struggling with classroom management, if any teacher who's struggling with classroom management, who's struggling to find their place in managing a class, this is not going to fix that. This is a way of instructing, and it certainly helps with classroom management in lots of different ways. And I could speak to that and how that's improved my practice. But nobody should think that PL or IL is a bandage for classroom management problems or for behavior problems, right? For first and foremost, right?
I think a specific example I would have for the managing the actual like lessons, if that's kind of where that was going, would be to take like one step at a time. This is something I've been coached on a lot, that it doesn't have to be that everything is a choice. There are parameters. So like, for example, right now I'm working on a project with my students that has to do with the language of like geography and climate, and there's some other parts of that too. But instead of just thinking like, okay, you can research anywhere you want and you can present it however you want, I narrowed it down to like one of the US states or somewhere else if you give a good argument for why and how you're going to be able to get your research done, and a couple of choices of how you present it, unless you have another idea again. So just, I know that I went into it thinking like, if I give them those, then it's not really personalized. And some people would probably argue that it's not, because it's always on a trajectory, but that has helped me kind of not get too overwhelmed with it.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, along the same lines, I started, like I said, this whole process has been baby steps for me. And I haven't gotten to the point where they're able to make their decisions on what they want to study. And my student surveys show that too. But the choice, not just in the space in the room, but I started with menu boards, and that is not personalized learning. But for my students to start making those choices, and then it went to the menu board where you have to pick so many that add up to 50, or and making those steps so that they were even capable of telling me what they want to learn.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. Even in the flipped classroom, my students don't decide what they learn, and they don't always decide how to learn it, right? A lot of it is individualized and personalized pacing, right? They get to take as much time as they want to show mastery of certain skills, right? And I mean, as someone who's done this for years, lots of times I work in a classroom where kids have never learned that way. And so sitting down on the first or the second day of school and going, okay, what do you mean I have as much time as I want to finish this? And there are some kids that take to that really quickly and realize, ooh, like when I finish this, I can move on. And then when I finish that, I can move on. And when I finish that, I can move on, right? They take to it quick and they love it. And there are some kids that are like, oh, okay, I get to screw around for a while. My teacher's not even, right? I can work on this for a week. And they don't realize what it's all about yet. Some kids will take to it faster than others. I think that what working in a flipped classroom, in PL and in IL, and kind of how the advantage that gives to the teacher is the amount of time you have to spend with those kids. Now you have students who are intrinsically motivated, who are latched on to activities and have assignments and are able to work at their own pace, really excelling. And you, the teacher, now have more time freed up to work with students that need that social emotional learning, right? That need to learn, how to be motivated. I think that's something that a traditional classroom lacks across the board. You just don't have time to talk to kids about why they need to learn stuff. It's more like you need to learn this, and then you need to learn this, and then you need to learn this. You have so much to cram in, there is no time to individualize pacing or anything to that regard, right? Everyone's doing the same thing at the same time. And so when you break out of that and you have opportunities for kids to be working on all sorts of different stuff at different times, it's not about everybody plodding along at the same pace. It's about everybody's pace meaning something to them, and so as the teacher, that changes your role entirely, right? It's not, you're not holding the information anymore and handing it over to the entire class one lesson at a time. Kids are getting it when they need it and how they need it. And sometimes that lesson is motivational, and inspirational. And, come on, man, like you can do this. And the great part is you have that time, when you fill in those gaps, those social emotional gaps, and you handle those social emotional objectives that lots of kids need, especially at schools like ours, right? Lots of kids have social emotional needs that are just so large. When you start to fill in those gaps, content comes much easier. Mm-hmm. Learning comes much faster.
So another follow-up question that Katie had was along the lines of assessments. Mm-hmm. So what role does assessments play in your personalizing instruction, and how do you manage all of that data for each individual student to then inform and personalize your instruction?
I can answer how I have done it with my current class, and then a little bit in the past. I think right now I and I know this is kind of narrow because not everyone has access to technology, but something that has really helped me manage it is have students orally record their progress on whatever we're doing. So make a video of themselves speaking. Some students aren't comfortable with that, but most of them are, and that has really helped me be able to gather because oral language is so important in what I'm teaching. That has really helped. And then I would say that, the same way I think in a traditional classroom, looking at where you need to pull students to give them extra support, that's still happening. And in the past, when I did this in like a math, or when I tried some of these strategies in the math classroom, math intervention, I had students writing their like goals on their desks basically, and then they actually learned to manage, but that was also through more of like an online kind of like what Mr. C does. So those are two ways that I've done some of that.
I'll speak to assessments. I guess when you talk about assessments, that's a loaded question, right? Mm-hmm. Are we talking about gigantic state-based, like statewide formal assessments? Are we talking about district assessments? I think when you break the traditional mindset of how school is, and kids start to become more independent learners, they're far more willing to sit in front of real high stakes assessments. I'm talking like state tests and district tests, and to be more thoughtful about what they're being asked, right? When kids are used to being spoon-fed everything that they do, and they sit in front of something confusing and can't ask questions about it to their teachers or ask their teacher how they're supposed to answer, you're really setting them up for failure. When you put kids into crazy, scary environments where they're not sure what they're supposed to be doing and they have to figure it out themselves, and then you put them in front of formal assessments that are similar, they do much better. just from a mindset standpoint, right? Just the fact that they sit down in front of a test and go, what am I supposed to be doing here? Instead of, what am I supposed to be doing here? You just get entirely different results. I've been met with really, really good growth in state and in large scale assessments. We're talking about daily exit tickets, or if we're talking about objective or unit assessments, that's something that I leave entirely to technology at this point almost. All of our skills practice is digital, it's adaptive, kids self-manage it, they completely self-assess. They share their results with me, but that's something that they completely control. Objective assessments and unit assessments as well. So all of my unit assessments are completely adaptive. They pull from question banks. Kids can take them 100 times if they need to before they prove that they've mastered it, which is interesting because you start to use these assessments as instructional tools, right? They get a 70% on a unit assessment. Most teachers in a proficiency-based classroom would be like, wow, that's great. That's not good enough in a mastery-based classroom. You take that again and again and again until you get a 90% or a 100%, and they can use these tests that they take again and again and again as ways to figure out, what did I do wrong here? And something they have complete control over. I mean, if they need me to help answer that question for them, I'm there. If they want to look at it themselves and figure out what they did wrong, then they can do that. If they want to use somebody sitting next to them who already passed the test to figure that out, they can do that too. And I'm not correcting tests all night long, right? I'm not correcting math worksheets at all. I mean, I haven't done that in 7 years. Which is great, because I get to spend that time doing what I love doing, which is being with the kids and being that motivator and helping them connect the dots in education as opposed to create those dots for them, if that makes any sense.
I was just going to add that, and in terms of getting my students to know where they're at, to know what their goal is, to know what their next step is, it's very visual in my room. So it's, they have in their binders their individual IEP goals, and they have bins that we have put together in conference directly with the student with activities and tools they need to work on those goals. So they always have those options, but also bigger goals of things that we're studying, or the goals that I choose as overarching in terms of my SLOs. My students know where they're at, know their next step because it's all right there, and we're just on a number system. Everyone has a number on all the different ones, and they know if I want to work on my vocabulary, I need to go to, I'm here, I'm working on categories, I need to go to bin 4, and I can choose how I'm going to work on that today. And then again, I have the time to be going around and conferencing and monitoring and knowing when, helping them realize when they've mastered it. You're here now. So.
Can I give one more nuance to the whole testing piece as well? I think something that we overlook in a classroom a lot of times where you have, I taught 4th grade, this is my 6th year, right? And you have kids who enter who are ready for 5th and 6th grade math already, and you have kids who enter who are still counting on their fingers, right? Who are in 1st grade math virtually. And when you have these adaptive assessments and when you have individualized pacing, where kids are allowed to really master concepts, there's equity in that system to a much higher degree than in a traditional classroom, where a kid, if they have to do the same lesson that every other kid in their class is doing, and they only get the same amount of time that everyone else gets, their best hope is to get a 70%, right? Their best hope is to get a pass, right? You have these kids now, when they're able to spend more time working to master these things and prove that through assessments, you now have these 70% kids proving themselves as 90 and 100% kids, just like everyone else. The fact that it takes you a little more time is completely irrelevant in the long run. The real relevant piece there is what that does to your mindset. When you when you look at other kids in your class where you would consider them smart and you prove yourself equal to that smart kid, just changes the way you think about yourself. Changes the way you think about school and, how you're acquiring learning and objectives and things like that.
So I'm going to ask a closing question. It's quite a large question, so feel free to kind of use some think time while others are sharing. Mm-hmm. It's about your biggest successes implementing personalized learning and turning over that control to the learners. and why are they successes, and or how did you get there? And then lessons learned, so mistakes that you made, you as the teacher, mistakes that you made, or how did you fail forward? And again, this is for teachers, so teachers need to kind of learn from your experiences. So closing question, and then we'll open it up to the rest for Q&A.
Can we speak to them separately?
Of course, of course.
Because I have something to say on challenges right off the bat.
Sure.
I apologize if I'm monopolizing too much time. You guys can throw me in there. But I think it's scary, right? And when you're trying things like this, you have to have an administration that's on board. And if you don't, you have to be ready to defend yourself. I got blasted on teacher evaluations the second year that I implemented this. When I had my own administration at my own school, not my current school, but my own administration, my own school coming into my classroom that I knew was highly functional and highly effective, and just ripped me to pieces on my teacher evaluation, right? Because they didn't see objectives written on the board, and they didn't see me up in front of class, that sage on the stage that they were looking for, where they were, checking off all their boxes on what a lesson should look like. And so to be really open and honest with your administration, and to be ready with, to know kind of the typical pushback that you're going to get from people that don't understand PL, and they don't understand, individualized learning and what learner-led classrooms look like, to really, be ready to pull back that curtain and explain to people what they're seeing, because it's very different than what you see in a traditional classroom. You will have people walking into your room going, are they just sitting on computers? Right? Are they just screwing around in here? Is there any real learning going on? And you're gonna have to show them where that exists.
I would say one of my personal challenges was letting go of some control. Like, I think that I came from a similar environment where if kids were sitting quietly, they were successful. If they were working silently, they were successful. And just like my own personal way of feeling like things are calm is like calm and quiet, and things are not calm and quiet. And of course, in a language classroom, they shouldn't be quiet. Students need to be interacting with and talking to each other. So to just shift my own mindset of that, and learn to trust students, and that I think that their nature is wanting to learn and wanting to get better at things. And so that's kind of I think I knew that, but I needed to actually let go a bit to be able to see it. And I think something else that I have found, one of my biggest successes has been to understand that this is still standards based, and that standards can be proven. Students can prove that they know something in so many different ways, and in ways that are engaging and interesting to them. And to take the time to think through how that might look and how students might be able to show that has been a big help for me in trying to transition into more of a learner-led classroom.
We out of time?
No.
Oh, for me, I guess one of my biggest challenges was not having a collaborative team of any sort, in terms of what that did look like in a center-based program. So Elisa was just really helpful in me. And again, I just stressed the baby steps. And so the biggest challenge for me was creating the appropriate and yet rigorous tools that allow my students to tell me what aspect they're going to study, how they're going to, and justify it by why. That was a huge success last year too, and with frames, but to be able to justify it and tie it to their strengths and their smarts. So,
any other final thoughts on successes, failures?
I've seen a lot of success with what would be labeled low lows in the class, kids who are multiple years behind. I've seen lots of success with GT kids who are multiple years ahead, and language learners specifically. Speaking more to the flipped classroom, right? My kids get digital instruction, which is different than a lot of other PL classrooms would be. But I think that for language learners to have instruction that doesn't come with the affect of having to raise your hand and go, what did you say? Or, could you say that again? Could you show me that again? And for them to be able to self-direct through a lot of that makes learning a lot less embarrassing, makes mistakes a lot less embarrassing for them. I think obviously, when you're working with kids who are multiple years behind in content, giving them that extra time to master skills. I had kids in fourth grade that they were in that total cycle of just going, I don't get it. And then as a teacher, you're like, okay, well, I have one day to teach this to you, so you're going to have to get it. I don't get it. I don't get it. And they know that you just don't have time to really hold them to any kind of expectation to learn this to a high degree. I think 2 weeks in to flipped content where you're like, hey, don't worry, you have the rest of the year to learn that if you need to. And there's lots of things waiting for you afterwards. Just changes the way, they don't even understand that. It takes them a while to get comfortable with it. But once, I mentioned before, once they start to master small foundational things and see themselves as able, the growth that I've seen with those low lows is just exceptional. I mean, multiple years of reading in a single year, multiple years of math, and just complete transformation in how they see themselves as learners from going from 3 years of incapability to 3 months of really seeing themselves as capable will absolutely change the trajectory of kids forever, right?
Did you? I felt like you wanted to say something
I
else.
experienced that same thing with growth last year in terms of these incredibly extensive matrices that the SLP department put together. Incredible. And so say for a vocabulary standard, moving 3 boxes is a year's growth. So when you consider altogether, I had 18 students had 18 opportunities for growth. I had 1 student in one of those make 1 year's growth, but I had students making as much as 4 years growth, moving 12 boxes.
Wow.
I mean,
That's a
crazy
success. That's a huge success.
Yeah. And really the biggest change I made was the changes I implemented for personalized learning.
So opening it up to the panel, I did see one question come through. Jackie's asked how your parent community has responded to the changes.
I would say that right now it's not quite extremely widespread, but I would say that with the parents who I have worked with and spoken to about it, it's been very well received because their students are happy. Their students can explain to them what they are learning and why they're learning it. And I think parents want to see their kids engaged in school and wanting to come to school. And I think that some of the changes that we've made and are, starting to make more of across different classrooms definitely engage kids and make them happy to come to school.
I would be surprised if the vast majority of parents aren't more interested in students mastering content, right? Mastering a smaller quantity of content than learning to proficiency, a larger quantity of content. I have parents responding really well to this, specific components of the flipped classroom, especially the fact they can bring instruction home with them. They can show their parents at home the YouTube videos that they watch, and they can show them the skills practice that they're working on. It's all shareable, right? Students can log on at home and do things that their parents can't do. Parents love that. Right, 21st century skills, and that whole school home connect is much stronger when you start implementing deeper personalized learning in a school.
And with the special education students on an IEP, you already have that contact with the parents, and you certainly have that one big meeting a year where you're working together as a team to set the goals. And so with what I learned from last year, I am, without wanting to make those long meetings even longer, I am trying to involve the parents more with the student there in that conference. Like, these are the standards, these are the expectations. So, and these are your what we have just decided on are the most important goals for your student academically and socially this year. But how engaging them in the conversation of not only what you want to learn, which you don't have as much choice over, but how are you going to learn that? And how then can the parents support us at home? So it gives you that support too. Okay, so he wants to learn this. How can you support that at home? I can give you this. I give, and we can share this. So baby steps again, but I've made some progress this year in that sense too.
Well, I mean, parents want to see more than anything else their students are engaged with school, right? And interested in learning and feeling capable, right? And those are cornerstones of personalized learning and individualized learning, right? Like, we start with engagement and build from there. And so it's very typical for parents to go right along, to absolutely love PL implementation at school. I can't think of the years I've been doing this, a single parent that said, nah, I want mini lesson style instruction for my kid. I want gradual release in a traditional classroom. There's been 0 people that have come forward and said anything like that. So, I mean, the proof is in the pudding with student engagement.
Well, thank you all. Sadly, our hour is coming to a close, so I'm going to close us out. And since we have one working computer, we're switching the camera. And they're all giving each other high fives over here. Just so you all know. Oh, some fist bumps, sorry. So to close us out, I wanted to at least point you in the right direction of some resources to add to your knowledge on Learner as Lead and Teacher as Facilitator. There is a Schoology course. If you log on and or register for Schoology as an instructor, feel free to use the access code above. Try to join a course and use that access code, and you'll then be given access to all of the resources that we've compiled at the Imaginarium along this topic. And then we've also added the bit.ly or the link for this particular slide presentation. And as we close out, I want to give a huge thanks to the teacher panel for taking the time, staying here late. It's already dark outside. They have volunteered to share their expertise, and we're so grateful to all of you to not only give specific examples of how to change that control and give the learners more lead, but more importantly, begin to let teachers know that there's a mindset shift and a culture shift, and that all it takes is baby steps. I think many of you even use the word baby steps a few times. So it does take a little bit of courage just to begin that process. But as you all shared, it's not only is it baby steps, but it's also failing forward. So please go ahead and try, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Big thanks to Elisa for planning this webinar. She's our in-house expert on Learner as Lead, so a big thanks to Elisa as well. We at the Imaginarium and Communities of Practice are hosting monthly webinars, typically on the first Tuesday of every month on various PL topics. So if you have any ideas or food for thought or needs, please reach out to either me or Elisa to generate those ideas and give us more ideas as to what you all would love to learn more about. And last but not least, we have recorded this webinar, so it will be accessible on the Imaginarium website, imaginarium.dpsk12.org, on the resource page. So thank you and have a wonderful night.